Militarisation as a short-term emergency measure will never really solve the illegal wildlife trade because it doesn't tackle those underlying drivers of inequality, of demand from more wealthy communities around the world for wildlife products, and it doesn't tackle the reasons why people might get drawn into the poaching economy in the first place.
One of the driving forces of rhino poaching is poverty, is inequality. The majority of rhinos are in South Africa's Kruger National Park. On the side of Mozambique, which is on the eastern boundary of the Kruger National Park, is some of the poorest areas in all of Africa. So for poaching syndicates, those who are involved in the poaching economy, they're able to tap into these vulnerabilities and this marginalization. The reality is that rhino poaching offers these young men, these communities, money that they would never dream of having. And so to address rhino poaching, these underlying drivers need to be addressed as well.
Donors, I think, have a great deal of responsibility for changing the kind of nature of conservation because of the funding that they're providing. There's a great deal of interest in funding projects that are more anchored in a security type response, in policing, in law enforcement, with indicators of numbers of arrests or numbers of seizures or numbers of wire snares found, than to say that demand reduction programmes, which may take 10 or 15 years to produce any kinds of concrete results, it's much more difficult to show that that will produce results in the timeframes that donors require.
Green militarization is one of the main approaches to addressing the rhino poaching problem in South Africa and Mozambique. So the role of green militarization in this area cannot be understated.
As part of militarised responses, what we've seen is a number of sort of really big, well-known conservation NGOs working in partnership with private military companies or contracting ex-military to act as trainers for conservation professionals. The challenge with that is that they bring with them a mindset that certain types of communities are the enemy from which wildlife needs to be protected. But there's an under-acknowledged politics of race in militarised approaches. What we quite often see is European or North American military trainers who provide training for rangers in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and the optics of that is the imagery is often used of the white trainer imparting knowledge to African rangers. Militarisation in particular is a much more spectacular form of conservation, so it's one that's very easily consumable through images, texts and films. And so we've seen some very high profile films, Netflix films like Virunga with the tagline of "Conservation is War", where there's a kind of an opportunity to consume the warscape of the park and the kinds of everyday struggles that the rangers are engaged in. Rangers, for instance, we know that there are increasing reports of post-traumatic stress disorder because they're engaged in much more militarised operations which they perhaps weren't prepared for. They might have been trained in ecological monitoring, and then suddenly, as a result of spikes in poaching, they're having to engage in much more militarised forms of law enforcement and of protection of those species. If communities in and around protected areas or communities that live with wildlife experience the negative effects of more militarised responses, then they're much less likely to want to be involved in cooperation and working with conservation authorities going into the future. And at the end of the day, it's the very communities that live with wildlife who we're going to rely on in the future for sustaining those species in the longer term. And so with a militarised response, what we can see is perhaps we're targeting the wrong actors with the wrong kind of tactics. We're not going to get the right kinds of solutions to solve the illegal wildlife trade in the longer term.